Welcome to this video. In the video, we are covering a roundtable that I did on the Sports Nutritionist podcast on the concepts of intuitive eating and the dogmatic approaches and camps that exist for it. We've seen people be very, very pro-intuitive eating, saying that meal plans fail, diets fail, so we shouldn't be doing it. They're really part of the whole body positive image camp. We have people on completely the other side of the fence that throw it out and say that if you're just eating based on what you feel, then you won't be eliciting any responses or changes with your performance or body composition or weight management, because if I'm hungry, I'm just going to be eating junk. So we shouldn't be letting internal cues govern what we're doing. So in this, my two guests and the two people that I interviewed are Mackenzie Baker and Kyle Weber. Now, Mackenzie is currently a master's student doing his master's majoring in sports and exercise nutrition. But Mackenzie, for the last 3 to 4 years now, has predominantly coached with a really low amount of non-tracking metrics for his clients and using non-tracking tools to help them improve their nutritional literacy. Kyle, on the other hand, Kyle was one of the very first online nutrition coaches in Australia, one of the very first online bodybuilding nutrition coaches. He has a wealth of experience prepping and competing in shows himself, as well as prepping and competing athletes. Kyle has a bachelor's in human nutrition, as well as studying at a postgraduate level, psychology, majoring around behaviors as it relates to body image and nutrition. Now, the intention of this interview and this episode was to actually just flesh out and look at intuitive eating and its utility, especially as it relates to the sport of bodybuilding and people maximizing their off seasons, because there seems to be a large trend lately where people are really focused on having to track every single food to the gram and macronutrient to the gram in order to maximize their off season. So given that Dr. Eric Helms published a paper back in 2019 that looks at the paradigm shift required for bodybuilding and submitted a lot of really, really useful and important information as it relates to the behavioral science and psychology of competitors and how we need to be moving that and shifting toward a more sustainable approach, and intuitive eating was a part of that. We wanted to address this directly.
I checked it out, I think 2 weeks ago now. I read the whole thing, wrote notes on it, really got into it. I think it's a fantastic paper, and I think that it sheds light on like the elephant in the room when it comes to physique sports. Like, I think most people know that there's some pretty screwed up stuff happening below the surface that doesn't get much attention. And Eric's basically done a fantastic job of just openly, firstly identifying it, outlining it, and then talking about some of the outcomes of it.
I think it was extremely relevant and valid for an industry that is lacking in the elements of behavioral science towards eating, and potential contraindications that can be occurring from getting into physique sports. I think this paper that Eric's done has just opened a huge door into some of the things that we really need to be considering that we've all kind of thought about before, and we've kind of pinged ideas back and forth around, what kind of issues can be occurring as we are trying to rely on our intuition, whether it's coming into a competition, whether it's coming out of a competition.
Then we dove into what intuitive eating actually is. So in essence, intuitive eating is really just a weight neutral strategy, but some people have their bastardized dogmatic versions of this. So it may be anything from eating whatever you feel like, whenever you feel like, which would be more of the track everything camp approach. Otherwise, if you're not measuring, you can't manage it style of thinking, versus the people that say we need to be intuitive eating and that diets fail 99% of the time. The subculture within the bodybuilding world is sort of like, well, no, that's garbage. And they poo-poo it, and they're like, well, and they write intuitive eating off as something where it's like, right, well, if I just eat what I feel like eating and eat as I'm hungry, then I'm just going to eat whatever and I'll just get fat because I'm starving myself and my body is telling itself to eat, right? Like, that's a throwaway statement.
That was probably the biggest thing that I noticed reading it. It brought up a lot of my own incongruence from experience with bodybuilding. And I can look at it and I can say, okay, the suggestion here is that we need to be implementing periods of intuitive eating throughout an off-season phase because it helps to increase that quality of literacy before getting into something. However, the inner bodybuilder in me goes, but how do you do that? Because I need to make sure that everything in my off season is spot on and it's controlled and it's perfect. And then later on you start going, oh, hang on a second, that's the neuroticism that we're speaking about.
Then they spoke about what a modified intuitive eating approach is to them, and then what it means in relation to an athlete maximizing an off-season or maximizing a seasonal approach.
The whole modified intuitive eating approach that they were alluding to, positioning after that kind of transitional period, which pretty much is all about being able to have higher protein meals in an off-season without calculating it as being something that is going to mitigate a lot of these psychologically controlling or detrimental factors.
There are a group of people who say you've got to track in the off season because if you want to be the best, that's what you got to do. And again, I see that logical argument, but I think in reality, less people than we think actually do that. How many of them do you honestly think are that dedicated to the level where they're like, yep, I'm going to track every single day in my off season, like indefinitely? It's only the real serious, like proper dedicated, this is my lifelong hobby sort of thing type people who are doing that. I mean, the people I know who've competed, including myself several years ago when I competed in ICN men's bikini, men's fitness. It was just because I wanted the experience. I wanted to challenge myself, do it once. And, a few people I know, they do it a couple times, but they're not tracking in their off season.
And then where the dichotomous approaches don't account for the shades of gray in their approaches. So you can actually still be tracking macronutrient ranges. You don't have to be tracking a macronutrient to the gram in order to still be tracking. And so that there are multiple shades of gray along the way as to how people can be approaching their nutrition and their nutritional control.
Yeah, I think that there isn't any evidence to suggest that tracking to the nearest 2 to 5 grams is going to make you perform better in bodybuilding. But I do think there's a logical argument for it. But I also think that people get tunnel vision on that logical argument and don't consider the possibility that you can actually achieve an outcome without tracking your macros. And the other thing we've got to remember is that even tracking in and of itself is not black or white.
It alludes a lot to something that I really took out of it, where they were alluding to trying to facilitate the flexibility of a non-dichotomous thinking style throughout the phase of competition, as being something that is super important because it allows someone to not have that element of neuroses that ends up contributing to all those extra, I'm sure we're going to get into this, all those extra kind of like biological factors that occur later on.
Then we dove into the key questions, right? Now that we've looked at the paper and we've looked at the positions on intuitive eating and then the position of modified intuitive eating, we started to look at the question at hand, which is, are you maximizing your off-season by tracking every single macronutrient to the gram? And then what evidence do we have to support that claim? So if you're listening to this and you would consider yourself evidence-based, but you're saying you need to track in the off-season to maximize your off-season potential, then that's not an evidence-based statement. That's an empirical statement that you have through confirmation bias of anecdote that really, to me, is no different to then suggesting like what we did back in the day, right? Which was this ancestral hand-me-down logic based on, hey, well, my coach was really good and then they told me to do this. It's akin to have tilapia to thin your skin 3 weeks out. So move from chicken breast and turkey and red meat to tilapia. That'll thin your skin. You'll have thinner skin on stage, and you do that in the last 3 weeks. That's the same logic. And I don't think people are aware of that. So like, if you do consider yourself evidence-based, you're in fact not evidence-based if you're saying you have to track in the off season to maximize your off season, because we don't know that. We don't have evidence to suggest that. To better understand this, we looked at answering the question to what the primary driver of hypertrophy is. Is it nutrition related? Is it training related? And how does nutrition govern that? What's the primary driver of muscle hypertrophy, right? Net positive protein balance, net positive calories. And like I would say it's resistance training, right? Resistance training sits above those other two. So if we're talking about what's one metric, if you want to track something that's like worth it, track your volume tolerance and performance in a hypertrophy rep range and look to progress there. That would be my suggestion. Like, to me, it's like saying hit your macros in your off season to 2 to 5 grams is like someone pissing on my back and telling me that it's raining. And if they say that's the priority and primary thing that's going to drive it, because it's not.
100%. We've got to remember that muscle growth is a response to a stimulus. It's a stress response to a stressor, and a stress being the training with nutrition just augments that. It just promotes that further. If you didn't track so neurotically in your off season that you actually felt a little bit more relaxed and you had other positive things in your life, maybe you might enjoy your training a little bit more.
And then we looked at how using the argument or using the position and belief that if you want to be the best at something, you have to do what the best do. So the best person that I know is doing this, and success leaves clues, and I need to model my behavior on them, and how that may not necessarily actually be the thing that, or the primary driver or the highest priority in helping them achieve their goals. It may be the sum of their other behaviors that we're not looking at, and how not necessarily modifying your behaviors or following what a world champion does is the best thing. People see world champion level commitment and then they think, oh, everything that they do attributes to that. And it's like, how much is it like one or two key things and the fact that they're like phenomenal genetic outliers that would succeed in spite of their protocols?
I mean, we got to look at how many of the like world champion people there are that are dedicated and committed to stuff, and then draw a comparison between the amount of people that are tracking to that extent.
It's not that behavior that's synonymous with success, right?
Yeah.
And it's like and it's like just because they're doing something at that point in time doesn't make it right either. Like Lester Ellis, the boxer, famous Australian boxer, was world champion. He used to get up and run at 3 a.m. in the morning, right? And he did it because his logical argument was, I was training when my opponents were sleeping, so I was getting advantage of them, right? Makes sense. How is that any different to our off-season thing that we don't, like off-season tracking meticulousness that we don't have any evidence for at the moment? As it turns out, if we were to look at like Lester Ellis, he probably would have been better off spending a little bit more time in bed and recovering for the longevity of his sport, right? Because we know how important sleep is. And finally, we spoke about just understanding what your limitations are, embracing them, that it's okay to have these limitations. Kyle spoke about how being 5'4" means he's probably not going to be a 7-foot NBA basketball player, but he still loves to play basketball and then enjoys the process of doing so.
If you weren't the genetically elite growing up or in the first year or so of you doing it, you're probably not going to get to the state in which you think you can, purely by hard work and grit and determination.
Yeah. If I'm 5'4" and my name is not Spud Webb, I'm probably not going to be an NBA basketball player.
I feel attacked.
No, but you know what I mean, right? Like, I played pretty high level basketball. I'm 6'2". I was not going to get a scholarship to an NCAA college unless I grew another 2.5 inches. It's that simple, right? So and it's the same thing with bodybuilding, right? So and if your rationalization for those behaviors is that's what the world champion's doing, but you're the 5'4" non-Spud Webb equivalent trying to play basketball, then that's where you need to ask yourself, are those behaviors actually going to get you there? Chances are the answer is no. Is that okay? Yes. And if it is, would you change your approach then to the sport to then incorporate a positive longevity aspect rather than meticulous neuroticism when chances are you're the 5'4" Spud Webb without a 42-inch vertical jump, right? Like you're not going to make the NBA in basketball. So there you have it. These are the highlights from our conversation. If you want to check out the full episode, by all means, go to the Sports Nutritionist Podcast on iTunes or Spotify and check us out. Remember, give us a like, give us a follow and subscribe, and then turn notifications on to make sure that you're notified when more videos like this come out.